Durante o século IV, a Igreja enfrentou uma das maiores crises de sua história, o arianismo. Essa doutrina, ensinada por Ario, afirmava que Jesus Cristo não era Deus por natureza, mas a primeira e mais elevada criatura de Deus. Essa ideia foi condenada no Concílio de Nicéia, que proclamou que o Filho é da mesma substância do Pai. O principal defensor da fé nicena foi Atanásio de Alexandria. Por sua firmeza, sofreu perseguições, falsas acusações e foi exilado diversas vezes pelos imperadores favoráveis aos arianos. Quando os bispos arianos tentaram depor Atanásio, o Papa Júlio examinou o caso e declarou que ele era inocente. Vale ressaltar que o Papa Júlio argumenta em defesa de Atanásio usando uma regra eclesiástica segundo a qual a sé de Roma deveria ser ouvida antes de qualquer decisão ser tomada.
O julgamento sobre Atanásio deveria ter sido feito, não como foi feito, mas de acordo com o cânon eclesiástico. Cabia a todos vocês nos escrever para que a justiça pudesse ser vista como emanando de todos. E porque nada nos foi dito sobre a igreja dos alexandrinos em particular. Vocês ignoram que o costume tem sido escrever primeiro a nós e depois uma decisão justa seja tomada deste lugar? Isto é, que a decisão fosse da sé de Roma? Se, então, tal suspeita repousasse sobre o bispo de lá, ou seja, Santo Atanásio de Alexandria, a notificação deveria ter sido escrita para a igreja daqui. Mas agora, depois de terem feito o que quiseram, eles desejam obter nossa concordância, embora nunca o tenhamos condenado. Não são assim as prescrições das constituições de Paulo, não são assim as tradições dos padres. Esta é outra forma de procedimento e uma prática nova. O que escrevo sobre isso é para o bem comum. Pois aquilo que recebemos do abençoado apóstolo Pedro, estas coisas eu vos anuncio. Epístola contra os arianos 5:7, seção 25 a 26, carta em defesa de Atanásio do Papa Júlio I aos Eusebianos, em Antioquia. Ano 341 d.C.
Seu apoio fortaleceu Atanásio e ajudou a preservar a fé definida em Nicéia. Após a morte de Júlio, tornou-se bispo de Roma o Papa Libério. Seu pontificado correu sob intensa pressão do imperador, que desejava a condenação de Atanásio. Inicialmente, o Papa Libério recusou-se a condenar Atanásio e resistiu às exigências imperiais. Por causa dessa resistência, foi preso e enviado ao exílio em Bereia, na Trácia. Após anos de tortura, Libério assinou um credo controverso que tem sido alvo de disputas ainda hoje e que será objeto deste vídeo. Muitos têm utilizado como forma de demonstrar que o Papa excomungou um homem ortodoxo. Ainda assim, no entanto, as condições em que foi o documento assinado tornam sem legitimidade autoritária, e quando retornou, Libério voltou a apoiar a fé nicena e permaneceu em comunhão com os defensores da divindade de Cristo.
Okay, so let's explore the questions surrounding Athanasius. Much can be said here. I'll try to cover this in just a summary fashion. Fascinating figure, doctor of the church, saint, great defender of the faith, was present at the Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council, as a deacon. Shortly thereafter, he was made the Bishop of Alexandria at the time. Alexandria is second in the Taxis, the order of churches, second only to Rome, even though Constantinople was trying to wiggle its way in there. A whole nother story. At the time, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, is going to be one of the most respected bishops, second only to the Pope. He was exiled from his see over, 5 times, actually. 5 times. There were emperors who were sympathetic to the Council of Nicaea and its condemnation of Arianism, the denial that Jesus is consubstantial or of the same substance with the Father, that he's divine. There were some who were sympathetic to that council. There were others who went against it, and they were sympathetic with the Arians. And sometimes it was the same guy, same emperor, who flip-flopped. So sometimes he would, actually be able to minister in his see in Alexandria. At other times, he'd be kicked out, usually by the emperor. There were local councils that attempted to judge Athanasius. He was never present for them. but not that he wouldn't have been, but they just judged him in his absence, and judged against him. There were 2 local councils that weighed in his favor. In the cases of those who judged against him, he always kicked it up to Rome, as was his right, and kicked it up to Rome, and Rome always backed him up, always backed up Athanasius. So in reality, Athanasius was never excommunicated by legitimate authority in the church. Local synods only have that kind of authority if it has approbation from Rome. So he was never, at any time in his life, excommunicated legitimately. What you'll often, however, see is there's a situation between him and Pope Liberius, where people will say the Pope excommunicated Athanasius. And they'll say Athanasius just ignored the excommunication, kept doing what he was doing, kept ministering, ordained people even without papal approbation. None of that's true. Athanasius was defended by Liberius's predecessor and by Liberius himself. Liberius was orthodox in the faith. He held the Nicaea. He did not at any point in time waver from that. Some will argue otherwise. We're going to get into that. But he was always orthodox. It gets a little more complicated, however, due to a situation that he found himself in. Pope Liberius, arrested by the emperor. The emperor tortured his priest and deacon, and then tortured Liberius himself, the Pope himself. And under duress, under torture, eventually the Pope gave in and signed a creed that could be read in an Orthodox way, but also could be read in a heterodox way. Not unlike Nicaea, interestingly enough, given that the term homoousios was actually condemned by a previous council as heretical because it was actually used by the heretics. Now, Nicaea uses the term in an Orthodox sense, but it was chosen specifically because it could be interpreted in an Orthodox fashion or a heretical sense. Fun fact for you there. But this creed that he signed, there's some deficiencies in it for sure. But could be given an Orthodox interpretation. Anyways, under duress, he signs this creed and also signs an excommunication of Athanasius. Now, I'm quite certain we all know an act of the Pope is only going to be authoritative if it's free, right? If it's done under compulsion, we already know it's not a authoritative act of the Pope. So if the Pope is being tortured and under torture says, I affirm that Jesus is not consubstantial with the Father, is that somehow going to impair the Holy See? Is that somehow going to say that now the Holy See has defected from the faith? No, obviously not, because clearly the authority of the Holy See is not being exercised under duress. Now, outside of torture, Liberius was always Orthodox, and Liberius always backed up Athanasius. But under duress, you have this situation. How does Athanasius respond? We're going to take a look at his own words so that I'm not just making this up. You know, it's right here. But sneak peek, he defends Liberius. He defends Liberius and says, look, he was being tortured, so don't hold this against him. Not only that, he did vacate his see after this decision with Liberius and did not attempt to go back. And not until he had the proper ecclesiastical approbation from the Pope. Did not push back against it and did not ordain anyone after his excommunication. Now, he knew that excommunication was illegitimate. He still vacated the see. Still did not attempt to return, even though it was illegitimate because this is not exercised with any kind of full consent on part of the Pope. So he was actually never excommunicated by the Pope because an act under torture, duress, An act when your will is being coerced in that kind of extreme fashion is certainly not going to be an act of the Holy See. Sadly, I mean, Liberius, for all of his great virtues, because of this issue, was, I think, the first pope who was not venerated a saint after him. So I believe all of the popes prior to him were venerated as saints. Be that as it may, Athanasius still defends him. So let's take a look at what Athanasius himself says with that brief introduction. Now, this is coming from a work that gives an introduction to the work that we're going to take a look at by Athanasius, his history of the Arians. There's some interesting stuff that you'll see in the history of the Arians. Sometimes you'll see Athanasius refer to himself in the third person. Sometimes he refers to himself like, in the first person, it's clear it's Athanasius speaking. In other instances, he refers to himself in the third person. Don't let that throw you off. That's part of it. And of course, his commentary notes that the writer occasionally, like many other ancient and modern, speaks of himself in the third person. But in other places, he clearly identifies himself as Athanasius. So don't let that throw you off if you see that kind of language. Well, in History of the Arians, Book 5, let's see, section 35, he says this: concerning the persecution and lapse of Liberius. When they perceived that he was an orthodox man, talking about Liberius, this is Athanasius saying Liberius is orthodox. He holds to the right faith, and hated the Arian heresy, and earnestly endeavored to persuade all persons to renounce and withdraw from it. These impious men reasoned thus with themselves: if we can persuade Liberius, we shall soon prevail over all. In other words, Liberius is on Team Orthodoxy. He's against the Arians. So if we can somehow get him on board with Arianism as the first see, I mean, that's a done deal. It's a wrap at that point. So they then brought various accusations against Athanasius to Liberius, and they attempted to persuade him. However, here's what Liberius says. When the eunuch Eusebius from the emperor attempts in vain to persuade Liberius, Liberius says, but the bishop endeavored to convince him, reasoning with him thus. Here's what Liberius said: how is it possible for me to do this against Athanasius? In other words, I'm not going against Athanasius. Athanasius is on Team Orthodoxy, and so am I. So I'm not going to condemn Athanasius, period. How can we condemn a man whom not one council only, but a second assembled from all parts of the world has fairly acquitted? Because you remember, several councils acquitted him, and the Pope backed up those councils. We know this in the historical record. You had local councils who condemned Athanasius and local councils who acquitted Athanasius. The ones that condemned Athanasius, the popes rebuked. The ones that acquitted Athanasius, the popes confirmed. And whom the Church of the Romans dismissed in peace. In other words, Liberius is saying, look, my predecessor has already judged Athanasius to be good to go. This church has already evaluated him. He's good. I am not going to condemn him. Who will approve of our conduct if we reject in his absence one, whose presence among us we gladly welcome and admitted him to our communion? So he's not going for it. They tried to persuade Liberius. He is not going to waffle. So what they do is instead they torture him. We don't know for how long, but after a period of a time of torture, he finally caved, and under duress, under torture, signed a creed that was certainly questionable in nature at the very least, and an excommunication of Athanasius. Not something that he wrote. The emperor wrote it for him and made him just sign off on it while he's being tortured. You tell me if that's valid. Of course that's not valid. Now, might we say, well, he should have gone the extra mile? Okay, maybe you can argue he should have had more heroic faith, but you certainly can't argue this was an act of the Holy See. Clearly not. So here's what Athanasius says about the situation. He defends Liberius and says, "Who that shall hear what they did in the course of these proceedings will not think them to be anything rather than Christians. When Liberius sent a presbyter and a deacon with letters to the emperor at the time that Lucifer," by the way, Lucifer was a really common Christian name at the time, oddly enough, right? "And his fellows made their confession, they banished the presbyter on the spot. And after stripping the deacon and scourging him on the back, they banished him too, clamoring at him, 'Why did you not resist Liberius instead of being the bearer of letters from him?' Arsacius and Valens, with the eunuchs who sided with them, were the authors of this outrage. The deacon, while he was being scourged, praised the Lord, remembering his words, 'I gave my back to the smiters.' But they, while they scourged him and laughed and mocked, feeling no shame that they were insulting a Levite," in other words, a priest. And notice, by the way, they'll use that kind of terminology of deacons, not saying that deacons are presbyters, but this is an interesting concept that goes back to Clement of Rome. "Indeed, they acted but consistently in laughing while he continued to praise God, for it is the part of Christians to endure stripes, but to scourge Christians is the outrage of a Pilate or a Caiaphas. Thus, they have endeavored at the first to corrupt the church of the Romans, wishing to introduce impiety into it as well as others." Now we know the churches, even well after this, have all affirmed at the Sixth Ecumenical Council that Rome never defected from the faith, all of the predecessors of the popes. But Liberius, after he had been in banishment 2 years, gave way, and from the fear of threatened death, subscribed. Yet even this only shows their violent conduct and the hatred of Liberius against the heresy and his support of Athanasius. See, again, here you got Athanasius referring to himself in the third person. "So long as he was suffered to exercise a free choice." So in other words, when Liberius has a free choice, he condemns Arianism and supports Athanasius. They knew they could not get him on board, so okay, let's torture him. "For that which men are forced by torture to do contrary to their first judgment ought not to be considered the willing deed of those who are in fear, but rather of their tormentors. They, however, attempted everything in support of their heresy, while the people in every church, preserving the faith which they had learned, waited for the return of their teachers and condemned the anti-Christian heresy, and all avoided as they would a serpent." So he was in favor of Liberius and even defended him. So Liberius never actually excommunicated him in any kind of authoritative way. So in other words, he was never in any kind of authoritative way excommunicated. In fact, Rome constantly vindicated him and backed him up.